Well, good evening, this is Handlock Steve wishing you a very pleasant evening, and here is the first of the two videos I spoke about, and this is about modelling. And the modelling I'm talking about here is projections on events that may take place in the future, and we've had two incredible disastrous examples in the last basically few years. One is the climate change modelling, which has been completely off, and I'm just going to show you this chart here, and it shows all of the projections that the modelers came up with, and then at the bottom you'll see that lower line is the observed data, and it's nothing like all the modelling data. And Neil Ferguson from Imperial College came out recently and said that there will be many more deaths due to the outbreak based on his modelling methods. And the whole problem with modelling is it's not as easy as it would first appear. So let's take the average temperature on the planet Earth. Okay, well, at first glance you go, well, that's fairly straightforward. You take a bunch of temperatures and you divide by the number of temperatures you've collected, and the result is the average. But where do you put the thermometers? What about seasonal variation? What about anomalies in different areas of the world? What about heat sinks? Parking lots, cities, this kind of stuff, airports. Where would you put all of those thermometers to get your temperatures to try and derive an average temperature? And of course, if you look at a chart, and I'm just going to show you this chart, this is the last 750,000 years of temperature change on this planet, and you'll see that the temperature goes up and down all the time. It is almost impossible to predict. And so let me give you another example of some of the intricacies that come out when you start modelling, when you bring things into the real world. So say, for example, you want to cook a turkey. Okay, you preheat the oven to 375, you baste the bird, you stick it in the oven, and 3.5 hours later you pull out a perfectly cooked turkey. Well, say for example you want to cook 600 turkeys. Okay, how do you preheat that oven evenly to 375 degrees? You could get a situation where the turkeys in the middle are burnt to a crisp and the ones on the outside are barely even warm. And then if you do manage to get the temperature even throughout the whole oven, so you get consistent cooking temperature, how do you get all of those 300 turkeys out of the oven at the same time and begin processing them for cooling and packaging? Because, as time is passing, bacteria is forming on these turkeys as they're cooling. So there are all these different factors that come in to play when you look at these kind of things, and it's very difficult to predict. And when you go into manufacturing, especially food processing places, you cannot believe the kind of technology that they come up with to iron out all of the inconsistencies that you run into in the real world. Another real world problem that we have right now is the just-in-time servicing system. And again, these people sit in a room and they work out situations where there are no breakdowns, there's no bumps in the road, there's no hold-ups, there's no traffic jams. They just assume that you can go from A to B in a certain period of time, and you're going to be able to pick up the goods and drop them off, and there's going to be no hitch. And of course, because it is just in time, we all know what that means, that as you are putting the last part into whatever it is you're manufacturing, the truck is backing into the driveway, unloading, and of course this saves warehousing space because the trucks have now become the warehouses. And so we see all of these kind of distorted things happening because they were planned in a room where there was no external forces acting upon them. That is your best guess based on incomplete information. And so we have to fill in those spaces We have to fill in those spaces as we go along, as we get real data on the ground. Anyway, let's go over to this article that I found. It's very interesting. It's an economic modeling group, and they are commenting on this very fact. Okay, let's go check that out, and we'll come back and I'll do a quick wrap up. Okie dokie, here we go. This from Zero Hedge. The model is sort of everything except reality. And this is via the American Institute for Economic Research. As a site focused on economics, AIER would rather have stayed away from commentary on diseases and their medication. In normal times we would have. The archives of AIER dating back to 1933 show that we had no comments on the polio epidemic, 1948 to 1951, the AF, 1957 to 59, the HKF, 1968 to 69, the ABF in 2006, or the SF outbreak of 2009, which was a strain most like 1918 and therefore one may suppose would have caused panic, but did not. We had nothing to say because disease mitigation is a job for medical professionals, not economists and certainly not politicians. The problem is that this time the disease mitigators, some of them, the ones in power and with the ear of politicians, didn't stay out of economics. Indeed, their plans for mitigation trampled all over commerce, life, and the freedoms that are necessary to make it function. For a few months in 2020, the presumptuous model-building disease mitigators became central planners, overriding the wisdom of not only medical professionals, but also economists, philosophers, political scientists, historians, and everyone else, including legislatures and voters. Our first piece on the topic ran January 27th. The focus was on the quarantine power, and the argument was simple. Because people are not ridiculous and know how to deal with disease in consultation with medical professionals, this state power should not be deployed. At the time, people said we were being alarmists for saying this. Nothing like this could ever happen in the US because we have a constitution and courts and a tradition of trusting the people. It turns out, of course, that we underestimated the threat of coercion. It wasn't just about quarantining the sick, it was about putting the whole of the country, but for the few governors who heroically resisted, under lockdown. This brought about economic collapse and increasingly social and cultural collapse too. We chronicled the disaster in real time on this site, which became an essential go-to source for factual information and rational analysis, in contrast to the mainstream media, which was pushing for panic and lockdown. On April 2nd, we published our first set of commentaries, CV and Economic Crisis, edited by Peter C. Earle. Amazon would not permit the Kindle edition to go live. They've admitted to us they incorrectly blocked the book. There is no going back, but it remains a reality. AIER's influence was blocked when it was most needed. It's the fourth time in our history we've been censored. Those were censorious times. It is, however, available now. Much of the commentary focused on the observed failures of the models being used by a handful of statisticians and epidemiologists. They predicted as many as 2.3 million deaths in the United States. The New York Times went one better and predicted 8.25 million deaths. If government didn't crack down and shutter non-essential businesses and lock hospitals down to become CV-only zones. Economists know something about the incredible failure of forecasting models. They have been deployed often in the post-war period. They came under heavy fire from economists of the Austrian and classical schools. They don't grapple with certain facts of reality. Second and third tier responses to policies, unpredictabilities of human choice, and the uncertainties of the future. There are too many variables operating in a complex system like a socio-economic order for any mechanistic model to capture them all, especially when dealing with an unknown and unknowable future. The same forecasting failures afflicted the models that panic politicians into locking down. They are too aggregated. They don't consider population diversity and how outbreaks affect different groups in different ways. They presume that planners can know things they cannot know, such as disease severity in the midst of an epidemic. Slogans like flatten the curve massively oversimplify social processes and human choices and presume to know far too much about cause and effect. It turned out, of course, that the models were horribly wrong, not only about the large death numbers, but also about hospital capacity, unseen costs, economic effects, and even the demographics of the affected population. Remarkably, none of the models even considered the impact of the virus on long-term care facilities, and hence contributed to the gross neglect of the population that should have received the bulk of the focus. The Wall Street Journal sums up the blizzard of data rather sharply. About 80% of Americans who have died from CV are older than 65, and the median age is 80. A review by Stanford medical professor John Lonadis last month found that individuals under the age of 65 accounted for 4.8 to 9.3 of all CV deaths in 10 European countries and 7.8% to 23.9% in 12 US locations. For most people under the age of 65, the study found, the risk of dying from CV isn't much higher than from getting in a car accident driving to work. In California and Florida, the fatality risk for the under 65 crowd is about equal to driving 16 to 17 miles per day, while higher in hotspots like New York, 668 miles, and New Jersey, 572 miles, the death risk is still lower than the public perceives. Future historians will be astonished to ruminate about what we did here. We shut down schools, sports, theatres, bars, restaurants and churches. Government ignored the rule of law and put individual rights on hold. But it is more than obvious now that this was all a huge distraction. The focus should have been on the aged with underlying conditions living in nursing homes. The models nowhere included what ended up being our reality, even though that reality was upon us as early as February when people in nursing homes began to die in Washington state. We should have seen it long before the lockdowns began. Now the modelers in the epidemiological profession need to learn what the economists figured out long ago. Human life is too complex to be accurately modelled, much less predicted. This certainly pertains to a novel outbreak. Economics in the 18th and 19th century focused on logic and principles. Economists sought to discern laws that operate in the material world, how incentives affect human choice, where wealth comes from, how production works, the function of prices, and they sought to introduce to the human mind accurate and realistic theories of the relationship between the material world and the human experience. Over the centuries, economics became a beautiful science. In the 20th century, that way of understanding economics came under scrutiny as a new generation of thinkers began to imagine a better way. John Maynard Keynes in the 1930s famously rejected classical theorems, but the problems had begun much earlier and lasted much longer. Eventually, economics was saddled with a thing called modelling, a technical approach that eschewed real-world data and experience for computer simulations. The American Institute for Economic Research has been fighting against this way for its entire history. Along with our work has been some of the best economic minds of the 20th century. Ludwig von Mises, F.A. Hayek, Benjamin Anderson, Joseph Schumpeter, and so on. It seems like epidemiology similarly took a turn for the worse around 2006 when agent-based modelling strategies displaced the accumulated wisdom of the ages, as summed up by Donald Henderson in this beautiful piece we republished. It is not implausible to think that we can all get smart again about modelling and outbreaks. Consider the words of South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem, who never locked down. She resisted, and I really like what she had to say. So this brings me to the question of modelling. While modelling certainly has a place, models have two major shortcomings. No model can actually predict the future, especially when it is based on data that is incomplete. And no model is capable of replacing human freedom as the best path to responding to life's risks, including this outbreak. This is why central planning of the economy has failed every time the government has tried it. In South Dakota, we saw modelling as a tool, and we used it to be prepared for a worst-case scenario. I thank God that the worst case hasn't happened, but we were ready, and we are still ready if it does. but there is no model that can take into consideration all of the factors that make real life work. A blind reliance on insufficient modelling has led some politicians to institute disastrous lockdowns that have not only jeopardised their people's health and their welfare, but also created conditions for a financial catastrophe that will cause untold burdens and costs on their people for generations. Well said, Christy Noam. Thank God there is somebody sensible in the audience. A powerful June 5th, 2020 editorial in the Journal of the American Medical Association makes the core point. Both modelers and public health policymakers should recognize that CV is not a unitary epidemic in the US and other countries. It likely consists of multiple, contemporaneous and intertwined sub-outbreaks, prominently including those in LTC settings. Distinguishing the rates and pattern of disease occurring in the general population from those LTC facilities is both feasible and critical to control of infection in these high-risk settings. Creating separate models that reflect how CV has affected these different populations could provide more accurate evidence to guide mitigation efforts in the community and in LTC facilities, and could be helpful to better understand and reduce the morbidity and mortality this infection has caused among the most frail and vulnerable individuals. We doubt the ability to create better models, however. Viruses do not behave in real life as they do in World of Warcraft and Hollywood movies. People are not automatons. They are choosing minds capable of intelligent adaptation to new realities, even outbreaks. Instead, we absolutely must recapture the wisdom of the past if we are going to deal intelligently with outbreaks in the future. We cannot centrally plan an economy. Computers are no help. We cannot centrally plan a response to an outbreak. Computers are of no help. For the sake of health, prosperity, human rights, and liberty, leave disease mitigation to the professionals and get it out of the hands of the modelers and the politicians they intimidate into implementing their plans. Well said. So this begs the question, how did our scientific investigation get so distorted? And of course the simple answer is because there are certain groups of people with an awful lot of money wanting to have a particular outcome. And so they paid scientists to look for that particular outcome, and as it says in the Bible, as ye seek, so shall ye find. You find what you're looking for. And so they were asked, the climate modelers were asked to find evidence of global warming, and so that's all they looked for. They didn't look for evidence of cooling, even though when you look at the broader charts and longer charts, as they did with the 750,000 year chart, you can see it just makes a mockery of any kind of modeling attempts whatsoever, because temperature on this planet goes up and down, and it has gone up and down since the beginning of time. Sometimes more, sometimes less, sometimes ice ages, sometimes interglacials, but the trend has always been up and down. And so to say that we're going to consistently head in one direction, of course, is foolhardy. You're bound to, get tripped up on that one. But as we see, the narrative is forced, and even when the data comes out showing the real data that the modeling was inaccurate, these people keep digging in their heels because they want to save face. They don't want to look like they're wrong. And of course our leaders, our politicians, have gotten into the habit of just handing off to these scientific modelers. They don't seem to pay attention to the changing data. They don't do independent research. They don't go online. They don't look at what other countries are saying. They simply hand off to the senior advisor and bow to their greater knowledge. Well, we see that they don't have greater knowledge. And when you hang on to the truth, or your version of the truth, it's a very dangerous thing. And of course, what we need to do is fund scientists to seek the truth, regardless of what we would like to hear, because, you can only make good decisions based on good data. I mean, could you imagine driving a car and the oil pressure gauge was incorrect, It was guessing at what the oil pressure might be under certain circumstances. The odometer gives you the wrong kilometerage and the wrong speed. Your fuel gauge says sometimes it's full, sometimes it's a quarter full, sometimes it's a half full, and you don't know, you don't have accurate data. How can you drive that car properly? And so maybe we need to, as I say, get these scientists, fund these scientists to find the truth and to ensure that when the real data does not agree with the modeling data, then the model is changed to suit the real data, because that's really what's going on at the end of the day. That's the acid test, right? What's actually happening on the ground, what you can see with your own two eyes. So maybe we shouldn't pay so much attention to the modelers in this day and age until they have changed their way of doing business. Anyway, if you've enjoyed this video, please like, comment and subscribe below, and I'd be interested to see what you think about that and how you would go about modelling. Should we listen to the modelers? Is this a good way to go? Or should we have independent observation and plan our way forward that way? Anyway, in the meantime, this is Hamburg Steve signing off, wishing you a very pleasant evening, and we'll talk to you very, very shortly. You take care now. See ya. Bye.